Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 10th and final session of this term of the Oxford Jurisprudence Discussion Group. We have with us today Professor Andrei Marmor. Everyone here knows him. He's the Jacob Gould Sherman Professor of Philosophy and Law at Cornell Law School. He has published many articles and books on legal philosophy, and most recently, the book Foundations of Social Reality by Oxford University Press, 2023, on which I understand there was an event yesterday at Surrey. Today, he'll be presenting the article Authority, Legitimacy, and Accountability. So Professor Marmor will speak for around 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to the usual Q&A, and then you're all invited to follow us to St. Aldate's Tavern in St. Aldate's to continue the conversation. Professor Marmor, thank you for coming, and the floor is yours.
High price to pay for a drink. Can I just say, I'm not a professor of philosophy in the law school. Law schools don't hire people to be professors of philosophy. Professor of philosophy and professor of law. And you tolerate me in both places. Okay. So the paper is entitled Authority, Accountability, and Legitimacy, and it's about the relation between those three things. So here's the thesis. The thesis is that a minimal level of accountability is morally necessary condition for the legitimacy of any practical authority. And I do mean any, with one exception, kind of exception, is parental authority. Parental authority is not subject to requirement of accountability, but parental authority is sui generis for a whole bunch of reasons, so it's not really a counterexample. So without accountability to its subjects, practical authority cannot be legitimate. That's the point I want to establish. And then I also want to demonstrate that this condition that I call the condition of accountability has some interesting implications, not only in the obvious cases where political regimes fail the condition of accountability, but also in the context of international law and the authority of international institutions. I want to show that there are serious reasons for concern about the legitimacy of international authorities because they fail or tend to fail the accountability condition. Along the way, I hope to establish two distinctions which will play a crucial role in the argument. One is the distinction between the legitimacy of an authority and its soundness. Okay? And the other is somewhat less important for us here, between moral accountability and practical accountability. So these two distinctions will play a role in the argument. Here's how I'm going to proceed. Okay? 5 steps. Step number 1, I want to show that there is a distinction between legitimacy and soundness of practical authorities, that they are two independent evaluative criteria that we apply to authorities. And along the way, as part of it, I want to say a few words on Raz's service conception of authority and show that it's really not about legitimacy as we have thought for a very long time. It's about soundness. It's not a theory about the religion. It's not a plausible answer to the question of legitimacy, although it may be a very plausible answer to the question of soundness. Step number 2, I will introduce the idea of legitimate injustice or legitimate errors, and will indicate how this supports the idea of accountability, or the requirement of accountability. Next, I will talk a little bit about the kind of accountability that is relevant to our discussion. And I'll mention various ways in which, practically speaking, accountability is achieved, at least to some level, in different contexts. This is the idea of practical accountability. Before moving on to the final stage, which is showing some implications, particularly about international authorities, I will briefly answer one major possible counterexample to my thesis that accountability is necessary for legitimacy. Okay? So these 5 steps are the steps of my presentation and the others. Okay, so actually let's start with Raz's famous service conception of authority. As I'm guessing you would know, Raz's idea is that authorities are legitimate because and insofar as they provide a service, and the service is making it more likely that people will act on the right reasons that apply to them if they follow the authoritative decrees, directives, than by trying to figure them out by themselves. So the authorities provide a service of making it more likely, at least in the long run, that we comply with the reasons that apply to us. And that's what he calls the normal justification thesis. And then it's refined by other important theses like preemption, etc. But that's the basic idea. Now, Timothy will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we all presumed for decades that this is, as Raz claimed that it is, the normal justification thesis, the service conception, is a condition of the legitimacy of authorities, practical authorities. Yeah? If they provide the service, then they're legitimate. If not, if they fail, they're not legitimate. Pretty much it. But then we kind of had some cringy problems. In one sense, the normal justification thesis seems to be too wide. It catches in its net too much. Think about expert advice, you know, meets the conditions of the normal justification thesis. Yeah? I'm more likely to act on the right reasons that apply to me if I do what my cardiologist tells me than trying to figure out medicine by Googling it. Yeah? So that normal justification thesis would apply to my physician, physician and me. Physician is not an authority. I'm not obliged to do what they tell me. Certainly not a practical authority. So there was this issue, and you know, Raz responded to it in various ways, and the people criticized. Okay, but then there is the opposite issue, that when you ask specific questions about legitimacy of well-known types of authority, telling us that they are legitimate only because and insofar as they meet the normal justification thesis, seems to be kind of incredulous, seems to be beside the point, seems to be not convincing. Suppose we ask, what makes the office of the President of the United States legitimate authority? Okay? Why is Biden legitimate? No, not Biden specifically, yes, but the office. Telling us that the legitimacy resides in the fact that we are more likely to act on the right reasons that apply to us if we follow the authority of the legislature. Seems kind of, no, that cannot be the case. Surely the legitimacy of the office of the president has something to do with the fact that the president was duly elected by a reasonably fair democratic process. Right? So that must be part of it. Yeah. How somebody came to have the authority they do is often part of their legitimacy. Think about a more mundane, mundane example. I have 2 deans, one in the law school, one in the college, what we call it in the US, arts and science. Okay, they are practical authorities for me. Okay, what makes it legitimate that they are practical authorities vis-a-vis my uh, role in the university? Well, it must have something to do with the fact that I joined the institution, the university, voluntarily by consent. And part of the deal was that I am subjecting myself in the terms of my employment to the authority of the deans. So in these cases, consent surely has something to do with the legitimacy of their authority. Right? Nothing to do with the normal justification cases. Right? So why did we all think that it has something to do with it? Just because Raz said so? Well, it's a good reason, but not enough. Well, because the way Raz initially presented his theory is important here. So what Raz wanted to do is answer something that we call the anarchist challenge. The anarchist challenge is intuitively, simply put, the challenge of answering the following question. Why is it ever rational, reasonable, consistent with our moral autonomy to do something just because somebody else tells you to do it? Yeah. Why would you ever surrender your judgment to somebody else? And the anarchists thought that this is a serious challenge, it cannot be met. It runs against fundamental ideas of respect for people's autonomy. And Raz's response to that was that there isn't really a challenge here. It's not about surrendering one's judgment, but there are very good rational reasons often to do something because somebody else tells you to do it, precisely when you're more likely to act on the right reasons by doing it. Okay? So Raz gave us a very convincing example, a very convincing answer to the anarchist challenge, right? But that is not about legitimacy. That's about reasons for compliance. That's about why is it rational to do something that the authority tells you to do. Well, it's rational under these conditions, the conditions of the service consent. Okay. So what is legitimacy? Okay. When do we say that an authority is legitimate? It's a pretty vague criterion, fuzzy to some extent. Okay. Here's how I understand it. Authorities have a package of normative powers that they claim to have and that they exercise. And then the question is, are there any moral reasons, all things considered, to doubt that they ought to have those powers? If there are serious moral concerns about it, then there may not be legitimate. And if there aren't, they might be. Now, why am I formulating it in a kind of negative conditional? Because I don't think it's true that an authority is legitimate only if there are all things considered reasons for having it. There are all sorts of authorities that we could do without. They're not absolutely necessary, but they are there. As long as there are no serious moral concerns about the package of normative powers they claim and they exercise, it's fine, they are legitimate. Okay. I'm not sure that I'm really, never mind, I won't give examples, that will get me in trouble, especially when Timothy is looking at me. He knows that I'm going to give an example from his previous post. Anyway, so that makes legitimacy a scalar. It makes legitimacy the kind of thing that can be more or less, which I think is totally in line with our intuition. So the idea is the more serious the moral concern we might have about the normative powers that are exercised by a given authority, the less legitimate it is. But again, there is a more or less issue here. And it's very much in line, I think, with the intuitions we have about political authority. Yeah? There are many regimes that are clearly legitimate. There are many regimes that are clearly not legitimate. They tend to speak Hungarian or Russian, or Polish maybe, and increasingly so Hebrew. And then there are borderline cases where we're not sure. Here's an example. Think about the Erdogan regime in Turkey. It's a democratically elected regime, and not just elected, re-elected several times. Right? Erdogan won a significant majority with the Turkish electorate for 2 decades now. But it's a horrible regime. It does not respect the rule of law. It imprisons people for their views, even for their bad jokes, or good jokes, actually. So there are terrible things happening there. Yeah? Those terrible things make it an illegitimate regime. I don't know. People have different intuitions about that, and it's not surprising. It's kind of a borderline case. Yeah. All right. Similar things happen if you think about authority, practical authority in the labor market. Something that we tend to forget, that the labor market deploys authoritative roles in large quantities. It's all over the place. Employers have practical authority over their employees, and they appoint other practical authorities to have practical authority over employees, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Now, we would tend to think that most of the legitimacy of these practical authorities in the labor market comes from consent. People join voluntarily to undertake a certain job. And the voluntariness means that they consent to the kind of authoritative structure that they're going to have to deal with. All right, but we know that voluntariness is also scalar, it also comes in degrees. There is more or less, and sometimes it's so minimal that the consent element behind it is not morally that significant, or loses a lot of its significance, right? People have to join or take up a certain job because otherwise they will go hungry, then telling them, oh, but you consented to this horrible boss telling you what to do. Not a very convincing answer. Okay. So legitimacy is about the package of normative powers and the question of how much moral concern we might have about it. Now, alongside legitimacy, there are also questions about the contents of authoritative directives and policies. Yeah? And those directives, policies, or whatever, can be sound or unsound, sensible or silly, just or unjust, and so on and so forth. Right? So there's always an issue of the justification of the particular directives or policies relative to the subjects and the reasons that apply to them. And this is what I call soundness. Okay? So authorities and authoritative directives can be more or less sound. Yeah? Can be more or less justified by reason. Now, it's totally possible that Raz's service conception, the normal justification thesis, captures the main criteria of soundness. Right? An authority is sound when we are more likely to comply with the right reasons that apply to us than we would try to figure it out by ourselves. I don't want to establish that. I don't want to deny that. It's kind of, for me, a little bit beside the point. What I need is the distinction, that you realize that soundness and legitimacy are two separate evaluative criteria of authorities, and one does not guarantee the other. Okay? That's crucially important. Legitimate authority can issue many directives that are not sound. And the other way around, you know, just because an authority is not legitimate, it doesn't mean that subjects have no moral obligations to do things that the authority tells them to do. In other words, we may have moral reasons to comply with authoritative directives, even when the authority is illegitimate. If I may, I'll use the example of Russia again. No offense, anyone? Just because the regime is profoundly illegitimate doesn't mean that Russians have no moral obligation to abide by the basic requirements of criminal law. You can't say, oh, well, you know, regime is illegitimate, so we can go and steal stuff and kill people and so on and so forth. No, that's a big no-no. You know, it doesn't mean that they have no moral obligation to abide by the traffic regulations or by adequate compensation for breaches of contract or torts and so on and so forth. There's a lot of stuff, many laws and directives that people might have a moral obligation to comply with, even when they originate with an illegitimate authority, and vice versa. Right? Just because an authority is legitimate doesn't mean that we have a moral reason to comply with every directive they issue. That's a hotly debated issue under the title of political obligation. So I will not go into the details here. Just mention. Okay. The important point is to see that legitimacy does not by itself guarantee soundness. Okay? I hope that's totally intuitive. Okay. But then you would ask, okay, so what's the practical significance? Why should we care, practically speaking, about legitimacy? We should care about soundness because that's about reasons for action. Why should we care about legitimacy? So there are a number of reasons to care about legitimacy. Some of them have to do with respect. Right? Illegitimate authorities do not command our respect, should not. Some of them have to do with the question of whether we should remove the authority. Yeah? Maybe even use force to do that. Okay? Illegitimate authorities normally need to be replaced, if possible, even by force. All of that. I want to focus on one practical aspect of legitimacy, why we care about legitimacy, which is doing the work for me in this particular context. There is a widely held view, which I think is correct, that legitimacy shields authorities from coercive interference in the exercise of their authority, even if they are wrong on the merits. And this is the idea that my friend Jonathan Kwong calls legitimate injustice. So I'll borrow his nice phrase. The idea is that if you act within your legitimate authoritative powers, then others cannot demand, they don't have a claim right that you refrain from exercising your authority, and they certainly cannot use force or coercive measures to interfere in the exercise of your legitimate authority. Okay. What does it mean? It means that the cost of authoritative errors, costs in terms of injustice or any other moral or other kind of cost, right? Any negative impact of legitimate authorities has to be borne by its subjects. Right? So if my dean is a legitimate authority, vis-a-vis what? Yeah. then I have no claim right that the dean does not exercise his authoritative powers, and if it is within the dean's authoritative power to tell me to teach contracts, thank God it's not, but it's a hypothetical, then that would be a big mistake. It would be bad for me and most of all bad for my students because I don't know contracts. But if his authority about this is legitimate, it means that I cannot force the dean to refrain from exercising it. I don't have a claim right against him. I can beg for my life and for my students' life, but that's it, right? And if he makes the mistake, I'm saying he because it is he, so. Okay. If he makes a mistake, then we, the subject, me and my students, bear the cost. Okay? And that's generally the case. Okay? Now, since it is inconceivable, I take it, practically speaking, that there would be an authority that makes no mistakes. It means that whenever we have a practical authority-subject relation, the subjects would need to bear the cost of error. And that is why, as a matter of fairness, authorities should be subject to some criteria, some condition of accountability. Yeah, practical accountability. Here's another way, kind of a way to think about it. We would think that putting people at risk without allowing them to insure against it is immoral, not justified, yeah, not fair. So we can see accountability as a kind of insurance policy. It's the only insurance policy we have as subject of the authority against just bearing the cost of whatever mistakes they make, right? They can make mistakes, and those mistakes might be binding, but at least we have to be able to find them accountable, to hold them accountable. Okay? That's the intuitive idea that underlies this whole argument. Okay? Now, what kind of accountability is in place? Okay, now number 3. Sorry. There is a huge industry of philosophical writing on moral accountability. You can fill a small library with articles and books on moral accountability. It comes particularly within the Strawson, Watson tradition of reactive attitudes and Scanlon's answerability condition or idea, which is kind of similar. And the idea is the way people in this literature use the idea of accountability is something like this. They would say that when you do something, when you do wrong in some sense, yeah, you make yourself susceptible to certain kinds of reactive attitudes of those who you wrong, and therefore they can hold you accountable in that sense, right? So accountability is understood basically as susceptibility to certain types of reactive attitudes like resentment, indignation, blame, etc. Okay. What reactive attitudes? Huge debates about that. Okay. This is not what I'm going to rely on. Okay. So when I use the word accountability, I don't use it in this sense, and I'm not tying anything I say to this literature on reactive attitudes and all of that. Not because I think it's not great, it's great, but it's not my business. Okay. Not. I do make two assumptions, which are in line with most of what people say in this moral accountability business. Some may disagree with that, but I make two assumptions without legal arguments to support them. One is that accountability is always directional, and the way I use accountability is the same. It's directional. It's to someone for something. Yeah? So if I forget my daughter's birthday, that's bad, and I'm accountable to her, and maybe to her sister, but not to you. Yeah, you don't get to ask me to account for it. Yeah, it's none of your business. So that's one assumption I'm making, and an accompanying assumption is that holding someone accountable has to be done for a reason. Yeah? Which means that at least in some contexts, at least in certain cases, it's perfectly okay to respond to a request to account for something by saying, no, it's none of your business. Yeah. So, you're concerned about my bluish jacket. Why that? I mean, it doesn't fit anything. None of your business. It's okay. All right. So I want to talk about a more robust sense of accountability. I call it practical accountability, but it's just a label. And to kind of bring the idea home, just think about the way we would think about the kind of accountability we expect from politicians, say members of parliament. Okay? We think that members of parliament have some political accountability. So what are we talking about? One thing to notice, I'll just mention it briefly, that there's always a certain domain of accountability. Politicians, deans, whoever is in practical authority, they are accountable to us, subjects, within a certain domain, not about everything. Yeah. So their various private dealings, their taste in music, their sexual preferences, all of that is not within the domain of accountability as members of parliament. Okay? And that, of course, varies with context. If we were talking about the accountability of the musical director of the New York Philharmonic, then their musical taste is part of the domain of accountability. Yeah? Okay. Now, within the domain of accountability, what does accountability consist in? And here I suggest two necessary conditions, right? There may be a bit more, but there are two main ingredients here. One is what I call the disclosure requirement. So practical authorities owe us a truthful account of the reasons for their authoritative decisions. Yeah? That's the disclosure requirement. Now, if you think, oh, there must be some counterexamples to that. Do they always have to tell us the reasons and truthful reasons? Well, I think there is one potential counterexample, which kind of proves the point. Not really a counterexample. Parents of young children, right? We would think, okay, they can make decisions for children, that they don't really have to disclose all the reasons to the children, at least not at certain ages or not in certain contexts. Okay, but why is that? Because we're talking about children who are cognitively and emotionally immature, underdeveloped relative to mature. Okay. But that's precisely the point. Not disclosing the reason to adults is infantilizing. Is treating them as if they were children. Oh, you don't need to know. Trust me, you don't need to know. That's not an appropriate response, not an appropriate attitude to that. So allow me, I'm going to follow with a little story. I realized that I am due a sabbatical. That's also a hypothetical example. I'm never doing so. I don't know how it happens. But suppose I realize that I'm doing a sabbatical, so I have to make a formal request from my dean. And I make that request, and the dean goes me to the office, says, no, your request is denied. Oops. So reaction number one, right, would be, why? Can you please explain to me why? So suppose the dean says, you don't need to know. None of your business to know. Trust me. Then think that's a failure of accountability. Yeah? Okay. But that's not enough. Suppose the dean tells me that, yeah, I'm formally, according to the rules, etc., due to leave, sabbatical, but I, the dean, had a religious epiphany last night. Angel Gabriel came to me in my dream and said, that Marmor, no leave. So I can't give you, I would be betraying my religious. Okay, I say, that's not an acceptable reason. Yeah, thank you very much for being honest and disclosing the reason, but it's not acceptable. So, feeling resentful, even indignation, and expressing it to the dean is not going to do anything, right? Because the dean's authority does not depend on my favorable opinion. So I would want to do something about it. I would want to file an official complaint, for example. Yeah? And that's the second degree. So apart from disclosure, there has to be some avenue, some mechanism for remedial measures. Try to remedy the situation, try to correct the mistake, the error. So there have to be not just reactive attitudes that are in place, that are appropriate, but certain reactive measures. Okay? So suppose I file a complaint, there's an email for email address. Complaint against the dean, here. I write out my complaint, and then I learned that that email address automatically goes to trash. Nobody's ever going to see it. Yeah. So then I file a complaint against this practice. Hey, wait a minute, what's going on? And then I learned that also goes automatically to trash. Right? I don't know if you remember, there's a side story in Kafka's trial where a guy wants to enter the gates of the law justice, law, I think. And the guard says, I can't let you in. So he spends his whole life at the gate waiting to be let in. Before he dies, the guard says, okay, I'll let you in, I'll show you. Opens the gate, and what he sees is another gate. He says, what's behind the other gate? And the guy says, another gate. And what's behind that? Same thing, just another gate. So if you discover that you would live in a Kafkaesque world like that, then you live in a world without practical accountability. That's the end. Some gate has to be open. Okay. So what practically speaking we have by way of guaranteeing some levels of accountability in different contexts, practical authority? Well, in the context of state authority, the best mechanism we have, surprise, surprise, is democracy. Yeah? Representative democracy is a pretty good system of ensuring political, practical accountability not because we vote once, but because we need to vote in regular intervals, regular and reasonable intervals, which means that we make politicians accountable at least to those who get to vote on their re-election. So I'm kind of happy to assume here that by and large, there are all sorts of nuances and debatable aspects, but by and large, democratic, representative democracy where we have reasonable and consistent intervals of election guarantee probably the best we can practical accountability in the political domain. But democratic systems, democratic accountability is in many contexts not an option, and in some contexts probably not even a good idea. Again, think about the labor market, right? Businesses cannot be run by kind of representative democracy system. I mean, there's some democracy here and there a little bit, but that's not the ordinary way in which at least the private sector can manage a business. So what kind of accountability can we have in the employment market, in the labor market? Presumably some collective bargaining measures, yeah. Which we seem to be familiar with these days more than others. Okay. And if all fails, right, and it might fail, exercising a right to exit, kind of second best, right? You don't get to vote on who's your boss or who's your employer, who owns the means of production where you're employed. At the end of the day, if you don't like, you leave. Yeah, that's the right to exit. Now, again, it's not a magical solution. I mean, many contexts, right to exit is like the right to jump from a moving train. Yeah, you can jump, but not very pleasant. Yeah. Okay. Then in many institutions, like the university, for example, we have hierarchical structures of report, right? So I have to report to my department chair reports to the dean to the provost to president to the board of trustees, and there we're done. Okay? There's always a God. No beyond that. So what then? Again, the right to exit. If all else fails, I have the right to leave. What I want to, the reason I'm mentioning these kind of mundane things, twofold. One, just to show that different kinds of practical authorities allow for different measures of accountability, different methods of accountability, some better than others, but they don't all have to be democratic accountability. Number two is that when we are talking about non-democratic institutions, yeah, when we don't have the availability of democratic accountability, then the less practically feasible exercising the right to exit, the more we should be concerned about failures of accountability. Yeah? The greater the concern about failure. And why does it matter? Well, we'll see that when we talk about international authority. Okay? So, I'll be brief now. Briefly on what would seem to be the main counterexample to the accountability condition. Even more briefly on what is minimal level of accountability, and then I'll say just a few words about international authorities. Okay? All right. So let's start with what's minimal accountability. Can we articulate what would be minimal level of accountability? Do we have some criteria about it? Obviously, it's very vague. Obviously, something that's going to have very fuzzy boundaries. Obviously, it's something that's going to vary between different kinds of authorities. Okay? All right, so can I say something more positive? Not just be evasive about it. I think I can. So here's a principle that I think is by and large true. That the greater the possibility of error on part of a certain type of authority, the more stringent the accountability condition should be. Okay? And this would be very much in line with our intuition that the accountability condition in politics, in the political domain, should be more stringent than in other domains. And why is that? Because political authorities are more prone to error. Why are they more prone to error? Not because they are more stupid than other authorities. Sometimes you would think that's the case, but not necessarily. Two reasons. One, there's no expertise in politics. There are epistemic reasons. Right? But more importantly and more interestingly, has to do with reasonable pluralism. So assuming the kind of standard liberal assumption that we live in societies where different segments of the population have profound yet reasonable disagreements about matters of the good and the just, it means that almost any serious political decision is going to upset some people, reasonable people, right? It's going to be seen by some segments of the population within the bounds of reasonable disagreement as unjust or mistaken, bad policy, right? And that's unavoidable, which makes the frequency of errors in politics, at least relative to certain segments of the population, much greater than in many other contexts. So I think that the stringency of accountability in politics should be greater. Okay, what's the counterexample? The judiciary, courts. We are told that there are very good reasons to shield the courts and judges from accountability. Now, in the common law system, courts and judges clearly comply with the disclosure requirement because they have to justify their decisions by detailed reasons. So the problem is not the disclosure requirement, but the problem is that they don't seem to be accountable in any other way. Okay, so they have this, like the dean, who has to tell me what her reasons were, but if they are crazy, there's nothing I can do about it. So the idea is judges are shielded from, and we think that this is as it should be. This is one of the hallmarks of the rule of law, that we have an independent, unaccountable judiciary. So is that really a counterexample? Okay, so now part of my answer is going to be trivial, hopefully uncontroversial, and part of it is going to be very controversial, but I've dealt with that controversy in other papers. Okay, so the trivial answer is, in matters of ordinary law, ordinary statutory interpretation, if you like, in other words, non-constitutional cases, the courts are accountable to the legislature. So they eventually are accountable in ordinary democratic processes. How is that? Simple. Legislature does not like what the court decides, it can change it. And it happens. I don't have British examples, but I have plenty of American examples. Okay? Supreme Court renders a decision. Congress thinks it was a big mistake. They enact a law annulling the decision, sometimes with retroactive effect. And that's fine. That is as it should be, because it brings the judicial process into the fold of ordinary democratic accountability. Of course, things in reality are more complicated, blah, blah, blah. All right, but then what about constitutional matters? Right? If the US Supreme Court makes a constitutional decision, like, whoops, overturning its previous ruling about the right to abortion, there's nothing Congress can do about it. Okay? Not at the constitutional level. So, about constitutional matters, it seems that courts are indeed not accountable. Why do I say it seems? Because that's true about the American system, the USA model. It's not true about many, many other constitutional systems. Problem is the USA constitutional system that unfortunately has been copied in many other countries is that the US Constitution is extremely rigid. It's extremely difficult to amend. So it's extremely difficult to bring Supreme Court decisions on constitutional matters into the fold of some democratic accountability, even a supermajority requirement, because constitutional amendments are not just supermajority, they are supermajority. That's practically almost impossible. Okay. Now, all this in the context of what's happening in my country of origin these days makes me embarrassed because my friends are fighting for retaining judicial independence. I'm talking about Israel. Hundreds of thousands of people are out in the streets protesting the government's judicial reform, as it were. So it seems that they are engaged in a struggle for shielding the courts from accountability. Am I objecting to that? No, I'm not. But this is not about Israeli politics. So if you want over the drinks, I can explain what the differences are, just for the record. Yeah. All right. A few words on international authorities. So the idea that international authorities are in trouble with respect to accountability is not new. I mean, it's out there in the literature, has been out there in the literature, even in popular press in some. What I think my point here is that the accountability conditions indeed casts a big shadow over the legitimacy of international authorities. So it's kind of showing, look, this has pretty far-reaching implications. What kind of authorities I'm talking? What's going on? So here's how things work, by and large, right? We're kind of extremely stylized. At some point in time, a bunch of countries, a bunch of states gather, decide to establish some international authority, an international court, a trade organization, some other institution that's targeted with certain tasks like the IMF, the World Bank, the WHO, IAEA, all those. And they, sign a treaty, ratify the treaty, and then, put in some money, and the international organization starts to operate. Now, the problem is that many of these international organizations, like international courts, trade organizations, etc., have enormous impact, practical impact, on the lives of millions of people that were not part of any of this process. Just to give you one kind of extreme example, but it's just extreme in its importance, but it's not unusual in its structure. In 1944, the Americans gathered 44 nations in a place that's called Bretton Woods, somewhere near where I live. I'm not sure exactly where it is. I'm sure it's a lovely resort. And they reached an agreement on the global monetary and financial system. It's called the Bretton Woods Agreement, which basically set the terms of global trade and global finances. So it made the US dollar the main currency of trade. It pegged the dollar to the gold, determined the gold standard, and it created a whole bunch of organizations. The two most famous ones are the IMF and the World Bank. Now just think about those two, the IMF and the World Bank. They affect the lives of tens and tens of millions of people around the world. They have done that for many, many decades on their own terms. And all those people who are affected by that have no, there's no accountability towards it. There's nothing. So what are the challenges here? Why this structure creates problems? Very briefly. So there are three main problems. One is what is sometimes called accountability distance. In the European context, it used to be called the democratic deficit problem. It's just mostly about the cultural and political distance, right? So we have an organization like the IMF or World Bank or, I don't know, Mercosur or whatever, and they make decisions for people. They don't speak their language. They don't speak their culture, right? They're not part of that culture. They know very little about it. And yet their decisions have enormous impact. So that's the distance problem. The second problem, I'll bracket, is the agency problem. They were talking about cases where countries sign agreements that fail, countries that fail the accountability condition internally. Yeah. So, and they bind their own people to far-reaching consequences without accountability to their own. And then there is, I think, a serious problem of inegalitarian accountability to the extreme. So here's what's happening. Take, for example, WHO, World Bank, IMF, IAEA, all these, yeah? They need money to operate. Who gives the money? The signatory states, but mostly the big ones, yeah? European Union, USA, China, a little bit Japan, etc. Okay? So these organizations are funded by a handful of states, I mean countries, yeah, that are the super rich, and almost none by all the others. But their decisions affect mostly the others. Yeah? The IMF is not giving money to the USA or to France, it's giving money to Bangladesh and India, etc. So now imagine the following democratic system. Imagine that, oh, sorry, I should have said, these international organizations formally are accountable only to the states that formed them, right? The signatory states, right? They're not accountable to anyone else. They're not accountable to individuals. They're not accountable to organizations. They're only accountable to the states that formed them, right? Okay, so imagine a democratic system that works like this. We get to vote every 4 years, so fine, but everyone gets a certain number of votes, say from 1 to an indefinite number. How is it determined how many votes you have? By your bank account. So say for every $10,000 you have in your bank account or somewhere, you get a vote. Okay? So Michael Bloomberg gets 1 million votes, I get 2, and so on and so forth. Yeah? That's how it works. Who in their right mind would think that this is a just regime? Right? I mean, this is unjust on so many accounts, but it's certainly unjust on account of extreme inegalitarianism with respect to accountability, right? This is a regime that will be accountable only to the Bill Gates and Michael Bloomberg of this world, not to ordinary people. So we think that that's unacceptable. Well, but that's what's happening in the international domain, right? These international organizations are accountable to the rich states. So we have a problem. You think, okay, but what about the right to exit? I said that as a last resort, there's the right to exit. So, yeah, if I lived here, I would be giggling about that. Yeah, there's, technically speaking, in some cases, the right to exit. Brexit was one of them. It's actually one of the most dramatic examples of a country saying, enough of that, I want to exercise my right of exit. No more subject to the international authorities in question. Okay, so we can, go on about the wisdom of that, the morality of it, thinking, okay, what Britain could do, Greece probably cannot, and so on and so forth. But that's not my main point. My main point is that in the context of international organizations and the international regime, in most cases, the right of exit is not an option, right? Because losing, foregoing the benefits of international cooperation is a huge cost. Yeah? It's what actually enables the international community to impose sanctions. Most of the sanctions that countries impose on others, the international community, is just withdrawing the benefits of international cooperation. So, right of exit is not always an option. What's the bottom line? Bottom line is, I think we have serious concerns, should have serious concerns about the authority of international organizations. Doesn't mean that they don't do a lot of good. Okay? As I said, soundness is something else. So they may be sound. There may be a lot of good that the IMF and the World Bank and WHO, et cetera, do, even if their legitimacy is in doubt. Okay, sorry I talked too much.